Ellavarikkum ende Vinithamaya Namaskaram. It really is a pleasure to join you on the memorable occasion of the 35th anniversary of Geojit Financial Services, this Cochin-based investment services company that all of us in Kerala can truly be proud of. In the last 35 years since your inception in the late 1980s, I'm told that your company has grown meteorically and today boasts over 486 offices across India and the GCC, providing services to over 12 lakh customers and managing assets to the tune of rupees 60,000 crores. As an MP from Thiruvananthapuram, I've often bemoaned the paradox of how on one hand, this beautiful state of Kerala is heralded as God's own country, and yet on the other hand, we seem sometimes to have the unfortunate tag of being the devil's own backyard for business. This reflects the precarious state of our economy and the political and bureaucratic red tapeism, regulatory obstacles, and petty corruption that often hinders the growth of local businesses here. Yet the story of Geojit in many ways gives us hope. It's a compelling example of how businesses founded and headquartered in Kerala can, with the right leadership, commitment, and approach, allow us to perhaps one day shed this unwelcome tag. My congratulations again to founder C.J. George, the senior leadership and members of Geojit Financial Services for your remarkable growth thus far. I join you in mourning the passing of your former director, Mr. Rakesh Jhunjhunwala, and I wish all of you the very best for the journey ahead. Now, Mr. George had asked me to share with you my thoughts on recent global developments, particularly the backlash against the once much heralded, much praised phenomenon of globalization. I must admit, as someone who spent nearly 3 decades at the United Nations singing the virtues of globalization and multilateralism, that I'm not so sure of its prospects today. Let us face the discomforting ground realities. We are living in an era where our societies are increasingly becoming fractured, where questions of identity and ideology appear to be driving us farther away from each other, and at a time when there is a vacuum created by the absence of a collaborative brand of leadership worldwide. It started with a global backlash against globalization that took 2 forms, economic and cultural. The economic backlash was straightforward. The poor and the unemployed in the developed world began to feel they had no stake in the globalized system and demanded to know why their government's policies benefited people in faraway lands like China and India with what used to be their jobs. A common expression was that their jobs had been shanghaied. They wanted to reduce the growing inequality in every developed country and go back to the security of older, more familiar economic ways in which each generation assumed they would earn more and live better than their parents did, something which for the first time the current young generation had to stop taking for granted. That was the economic backlash. The cultural backlash derived from the same resentment but expressed itself in a different arena. The political denunciation of global trade led to hostility towards foreigners, good old-fashioned xenophobia, as more and more people sought the comforts of traditional identity and ways of life. Rage was expressed against liberal politics, cosmopolitans and technocrats, trade agreements, immigration, multiculturalism. Animated often by bitter working class and lower middle class resentment of global elites, the masses rejected the entire brew of cosmopolitanism, multiculturalism, and secularism in the name of cultural rootedness, religious or ethnic identity, and nationalist authenticity. Some of you may remember the former British Prime Minister Theresa May saying that if you think you're a citizen of the world, you haven't understood the first thing about what citizenship really means. In fact, the world was seen by many as divided in David Goodhart's famous formulation between the somewheres and the anywheres. The anywheres being people who are comfortable anywhere on the planet, flit from business class lounge to five-star hotel and join international gatherings, whereas the somewheres are rooted in one place, immersed in one religious culture, speak one language, and share one ethnicity. Political leaders were quick to seize the opportunity to tap into both kinds of backlash against globalization. Populist leaders like Donald Trump, who rose to the presidency of the United States on slogans of America first and make America great again, and a host of others, from Mr. Bolsonaro of Brazil and Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey to Viktor Orban in Hungary and even Narendra Modi of India, successfully persuaded their voters that they were more authentic embodiments of their nations than the allegedly ruthless secular cosmopolitans they sought to displace. Others have been rising, from the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany and the Freedom Party in Austria, to the Party for Freedom in the Netherlands and Marine Le Pen and Eric Zemmour in France, none of whom have won national elections, but who've all come close enough to shift the national discourse. Together, such parties and leaders, combining nationalist fervor with a determined articulation of popular prejudices, have made nationalism the default model of national self-definition. And should we now, after Ukraine, anoint President Putin as the chairman of an oxymoronic nationalist international? Of course, these leaders were challenged by liberal intellectuals who lamented their defiance of the recent consensus that the world was moving inevitably towards greater integration, where borders were becoming less relevant and sovereignty could be pooled for the benefit of humanity as a whole. But the emotional appeal of nationalism to most voters put the liberal cosmopolitans on the defensive. If these were trends that preceded the pandemic, they have accelerated over the last 2 years of COVID, with borders becoming more rigid, communities further marginalized, and the notion of us versus them attaining primary importance. Consequently, it seems that COVID-19 has inaugurated an era of deglobalization, with the world embracing isolationism and protectionism more enthusiastically than prior to the outbreak. The COVID pandemic confirmed for many that in times of crisis, people rely on their governments to shield them, that global supply chains are vulnerable to disruption and are therefore unsustainable, that dependence on foreign countries for essential goods, such as pharmaceuticals or even the ingredients that go into making them, could be fatal. I remember America realizing with horror in January of 2020 that their favorite remedy for headaches, ibuprofen, was 100% imported from China. And as you remember, for some weeks, exports from China were suddenly halted. And the Americans said, what do? We get a headache. Nations tried aggressively to acquire medicines, supplies, and vaccines for their own people at the expense of each other. There was a rush to reset global supply chains and raise trade barriers. The demand arose for more protectionism and self-reliance, for bringing manufacturing and production value chains back home, or at least closer to home. These conversations found fresh impetus following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which forced all of our countries to grapple with difficult questions, from the limitations on state sovereignty, the credibility of the United Nations Charter, new disruptions of supply chains and trade, not only on commodities, all the way to issues like energy interdependence and the future of warfare itself. While the consequences of Ukraine are still playing themselves out, and COVID restrictions have significantly eased around the world, the pandemic and the resultant lockdowns reminded us that much of what seemed to be knitting the world ever closer together, and which we till recently took for granted, was vulnerable. The world economy has thrived since globalization began in 1980 on an open system of free trade. That had already been shaken by the financial crash of 2008-9 and the American trade war with China. The pandemic has exacerbated these challenges, with estimates suggesting that nearly a third of global trade fell in 2020, although a gradual recovery trajectory has started this year to emerge. But meanwhile, the pressure to decouple from China increased over the last 2 years, even as this year's sanctions on Russia have severely restricted trade, investment, and financial flows into and out of that country. COVID-19 had also convinced many that foreigners are to be feared, that strict border and immigration controls are essential, that countries cannot always expect useful help from their neighbors and even allies, and that national interests should trump international cooperation. Instead, the emphasis is on sovereignty, nationalism, and self-protection. The increasing rejection of dependence on foreign goods is mirrored in a rejection of foreign interference as well. The UN has every reason to worry about its continuing relevance, with its image in the eyes of the public in further decline on account of its perceived inertia in preventing the war or even mitigating the invasion of the sovereign borders of one of its own member states by another, a permanent member of the Security Council. Those of us who began to imagine the globe as one world have had to revise our thinking. Let us take the impact of COVID first. There's no doubt that the COVID-19 pandemic, for all the reasons I've already mentioned, was a mega shock to the global system that is likely to disrupt the existing world order. As sovereignties are reasserted around the world and treaties and trade agreements increasingly questioned, multilateralism, the once taken for granted mantra of international cooperation, could well be the next casualty. It was already in danger of being eroded before the pandemic. Britain withdrawing from the European Union, America leaving the landmark Paris Climate Agreement, President Trump pulling the US out of WHO. Now isolationist voices portray themselves as being vindicated. The World Health Organization's response to the outbreak, with its indulgence of the official Chinese line, points to the waning legitimacy of international institutions. Many of our global institutions and their agencies suffer from politicization, manipulation, and lack of representation and independent leadership. Had global governance been working effectively, the world would have identified the coronavirus as soon as it emerged, sounded a global alarm earlier about its dangers, and identified and publicized the best practices that should have been adopted by all countries to prevent or limit its spread. That this did not happen is a damning indictment of the state of our new world disorder. The same set of trends has another corollary in domestic politics. For many countries, the answer to the dilemmas and disruptions thrown up by the pandemic lies in strong government, in putting the nation's needs over individual citizens' freedoms, and in dispensing with democratic niceties from federalism to parliamentary oversight, in what the government deems to be the national interest. Support for nationalist strongmen, many of whom have used the present crisis to shore up their authority and power, may increase exponentially. The phenomenon of deglobalization that I've described has its regional implications too. Europe, once seen as a poster child for the virtues of regional integration, became the epitome of its limitations, since the idea of Europe crumbled quickly under the onslaught of the pandemic. The famous Schengen visa and the notion of border-free movement was the first casualty of COVID-19. The EU countries, even those members of the Schengen arrangement, threw up the barriers at the first sign of the virus. It did not take them long to rediscover the disadvantages and limits of the very free movement of goods, services, capital, and people that they had sworn by for 5 decades. Early in the pandemic, Italy, the first major center of the COVID-19 crisis, was denied medical equipment by its EU neighbors, who introduced export controls instead of extending solidarity to their fellow Europeans in distress. Geopolitically, the era of globalization coincided for the most part with what was dubbed the unipolar moment, a brief period of a couple of decades of dominance, politically, militarily, economically, and technologically, of the world by the United States of America. The era of deglobalization is likely to be marked by a new bipolar tension between the US and its principal competitor for the label of superpower, China. No longer will the US be uncontested in any of these domains. China's so-called peaceful rise for the last quarter of a century, fueled by American investment in its industries and burgeoning export trade for its manufacturers, has culminated in supplanting the US as a manufacturing and industrial power, rivaling it in economic size and exceeding its surpluses, as well as challenging it in new cutting-edge technologies like 5G. The worry is that a risen China will see no need to remain peaceful. Its belligerence with India on our disputed frontier, its assertiveness with its maritime neighbors like Japan and Vietnam, its tough new security clampdown in Hong Kong, and its trade sanctions on Australia all speak of a newfound willingness to pursue its goals aggressively. The coronavirus, of course, is far from being the first global bug to have bitten us, nor will it be the last. In 2001, we learned that anger and malice in the dusty caves of Afghanistan could take down skyscrapers in New York. The year 2008 saw dormant financial malpractices in the US rapidly metastasize into a global financial crisis. In 2016, Russia tried to register itself on the voter rolls for the US elections, spawning a new and global market for foreign influence operations. Now, in 2022, war and destruction in Ukraine have been added to the ominous mix. Many countries are putting up barriers, frightened and mistrustful of the outside world. Xenophobia and racism are on the rise. Instead of leveraging these institutions to search for shared interests that can make regimes fit for purpose in the 21st century, states are locked into an increasingly destructive zero-sum race. And all of this is happening while democracy itself is imperiled. We see the erosion of democratic stability in three forms: a loss of confidence in the democratic process in many countries, institutional issues that have arisen because of the ongoing assault on public institutions, which we've even seen in our own country, and, surprisingly amongst many members of the public in democratic countries, a growing preference for authoritarian alternatives. In a widely discussed paper, a pair of Harvard scholars, Monk and Foer, have argued that the health of liberal democracies across the world is failing, the scientific term being democratic deconsolidation, and that former consolidated democracies around the globe confront imminent degeneration. In the World Values Survey that is taking place every year around the world, there's been a considerable dilution of support for democracy and a growing impatience with the democratic process, especially amongst the so-called millennial generation, those born after the 1980s, that we can no longer assume that once a country upholds democratic institutions for a steady period of time, fosters strong civil society traditions, and attains a degree of wealth, that the future of democracy will be secure in its hands. It is, we are told, a fallacy, and we must always guard against this complacency. Conversely, the same data suggests that the support for non-democratic or authoritarian models of governance is rising in many countries. In the United States, for instance, the share of people who argue that military rule would be either good or very good rose in the last 3 decades from 1 in 16 to 1 in 6. Similarly, the share of people who believed in the benefits of strong leader who need not bother with the inflictions of parliament or elections rose from 24% of respondents across the world to 32%. Though their paper deals principally with the United States, these Harvard scholars have argued that similar sentiments are brewing elsewhere. And in our own country, a recent CSDS Azim Premji University study has said that over 50% of respondents in 4 large states of our country expressed a preference for an authoritarian alternative to our existing democracy. Yet, having said all this, having painted a grim picture of an increasingly fearful world, an increasingly nationalist set of governments which are less democratic in their orientation, yet I would still argue that the sheer complexity and immeasurability of our interdependence requires more and better global governance, not less. Turning our backs on multilateral institutions at the first sign of weakness is unfortunate. I spent 29 years working at the United Nations, and I can say with confidence that the key lesson it taught me is that the world is a better place when countries engage in dialogue, when they have a forum to talk through the problems they share, rather than resorting to tit-for-tat responses on issues they disagree on. In the post-COVID world, unfortunately, countries are turning their backs on such forums in their desire to reduce their exposure to external dangers. External forces do not only represent threats, they also offer opportunities that visionary leaders should seize. What does that mean? To my mind, even as our society becomes more insular, stratified, and hostile, there now arises a unique opportunity for talented leaders, like many of you in the audience today, to rise to the occasion and address the acute leadership deficiency that the world is currently facing. The New World Order will need a set of leaders to bring us back together. Individuals who, though rooted in their immediate localities, are capable of displaying the necessary vision and aptitude to think beyond their immediate borders, who can revive and champion the idea that we as a human community are stronger when we are together. The new leaders that the world desperately needs will be individuals courageous enough to think beyond their immediate interests and the allure of a bottom line, and instead will work actively to identify the complex challenges faced by our society and produce innovative ways to successfully address these challenges. Listening to Mr. George saying that the bottom line was less important than the interests of the customers, the clients of the company, that is the kind of message that the rest of the world can also learn from. These new leaders should work together to bring us together again, especially those who have till now fallen under the categories of the marginalized, the discriminated, the financially vulnerable, and the socially chastised. These leaders, therefore, will not just be managers, but indeed problem solvers and change makers. This is where each of you comes in, because it's a challenge for all of you. You must be more than managers. You must be more than client representatives. You must be proactively change makers yourselves. What are the qualities of leadership you will need to assume these responsibilities? A capacity for innovation, a willingness to work for the welfare of those around you, the courage to offer a brand of leadership that is anchored in empathy. And where there is discontent, whether in the public as far as a political leader is concerned, or in the office as far as a corporate leader is concerned, it is our responsibility to understand what provokes that discontent and to find long-term answers that benefit the maximum number of people. Together, for instance, we must now move beyond narrow concerns of national security, which is essentially freedom from terror and attack, to a broader vision of human security, freedom from hunger and hopelessness. Of a world where everyone has food, clothing, shelter, where democracy reigns, where people's creative and entrepreneurial energies are freed, where human rights are upheld and the environment is protected. Leaders like you must join hands with leaders in parliament, in civil society, in education, in journalism, and more. This is a world in which all of us are involved, and all of us can contribute to reversing the trends that I described in the first two-thirds of my speech. The only hope for the future, I believe, lies in international solidarity. The rapid and global spread of the coronavirus epidemic is a devastating reminder of the consequences of disorder. It is also a timely memorandum to sovereign states that the reassertion of sovereignty must not imply an abandonment of global responsibilities. When the current pandemic is fully and truly over, even though I don't see too many masks there today, there are still some, the globe must learn lessons about what happened and how international systems and institutions can be strengthened and radically reformed in order to forestall its recurrence. The same can be said about the ongoing Ukraine war and sanctions. Instead of strengthening the capacity of our global institutions to cope with a future crisis, the world's reaction to the virus and the war may well end up destroying the most fundamental feature COVID-19 has exposed, the idea of our common humanity. We must not allow that to happen. We must learn to live and work together again. With those words, I'd like to thank you all for your attention and wish Geojit once again a very happy 35th birthday. Have a wonderful conference. Jai Hind.